What if the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but transmits it? If the brain is a filter, what happens when the filter is removed completely?
Here's what we know about brains and drugs. LSD doesn't add anything to the brain. It doesn't create new information. It doesn't build new structures. What it does is reduce activity in a specific system, the default mode network. This network is responsible for filtering perception, maintaining the sense of self, and narrowing experience into something manageable. When that filter weakens, people don't report less awareness. They report more. More color, more connection, more meaning. Brain activity decreases. Experience expands. That shouldn't happen if the brain's job is to produce consciousness, unless the brain isn't producing it, unless it's limiting it. More than a century ago, philosopher William James proposed a radical idea. What if the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but transmits it? He compared consciousness to white light passing through a prism. The prism doesn't create the light, it selects what becomes visible. Remove the prism, and the light doesn't disappear, it stops being constrained. James suggested the brain works the same way, not as a generator, but as a filter, a reducing valve, narrowing a vast field of awareness into ordinary waking consciousness. At the time, the idea was dismissed as speculation, but James wasn't guessing. He was responding to data that didn't fit the dominant model. Decades later, Aldous Huxley returned to the same idea. After taking mescaline, what struck him wasn't hallucination, it was clarity. He described perception without the brain's usual filtering. Colors intensified, details multiplied. The ordinary revealed unexpected depth. Huxley wrote, "The function of the brain is eliminative, not productive." In other words, the brain may not create experience, but protect us from being overwhelmed by it. This stops sounding philosophical when we look at what happens as the brain's filtering systems weaken. Damage to the default mode network often produces experiences similar to psychedelics, a loosening of boundaries, an intensified sensory world, a sense of connection. Not because something new was added, but because something restrictive was removed. The same pattern appears in savant syndrome. After certain brain injuries, some individuals suddenly show extraordinary abilities. These abilities don't seem to be created by damage. They appear to be uncovered, as if something normally suppressed is no longer being held back. Now, consider near-death experiences. People report heightened clarity during periods when the brain shows no measurable activity. If consciousness is produced by the brain, this is hard to explain. But if the brain constrains consciousness, the reports follow a pattern. A failing brain wouldn't generate one final experience. It would lose its ability to suppress what was already there. Terminal lucidity points the same way. Patients with advanced dementia, unresponsive for years, sometimes become suddenly clear and articulate shortly before death. Their brains are more damaged than ever, yet awareness briefly returns. This leads to an uncomfortable question. If the brain is a filter, what is it filtering? Where does consciousness come from? We don't know. But we do know this. Reduced brain activity often correlates with expanded awareness. Dying brains sometimes report enhanced clarity. Brain damage can remove abilities and sometimes reveal them.
Each of these facts is harder to explain if consciousness is produced by the brain alone than if the brain constrains it. So here's the question we're left with. If the brain is a filter, what happens when the filter is removed completely? Do we lose consciousness? Or do we lose the limits that made it feel individual and small? Some near-death experiencers describe not disappearance, but expansion. We can't prove that's what happens, but if the brain as filter model is even partly correct, it's exactly what we'd expect. Consciousness wouldn't end, it would stop being filtered. If the brain is a filter, then consciousness isn't fragile. What's fragile is the lens. And when the lens cracks, something vast comes into focus. We don't yet know what it is, but we're finally asking the right questions.